Emily Carter had learned early in life that nothing came easy. The bell above the door of Rose's diner chimed softly as the cold mountain wind slipped inside, brushing against her ankles as she balanced the plates in her hands. Morning rush had already begun, and the scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. Emily moved quickly, her worn sneakers barely making a sound against the checkered floor, her polite smile never fading even when her feet ached. She had been working here for 3 years. Same small town, same narrow roads, same quiet life, and yet everything felt uncertain. Bills piled up faster than tips came in. Rent was due again next week, and her savings were barely enough to cover it. Still, Emily never complained. She believed in working hard, keeping her head down, and trusting that someday life might soften its edges. Morning, Emily. Old Mr. Jenkins called from his usual booth. Morning, she replied warmly, setting down his coffee just the way he liked it, 2 sugars, a splash of cream. That's when the door opened again. This time the wind carried someone new. He stepped in slowly, brushing dust off his worn jacket. Tall, broad-shouldered, quiet. His boots were scuffed, his jeans faded, and his hat shadowed his face just enough to make him seem distant. But there was something about him, something steady. Emily noticed him instantly, not because he stood out, but because he didn't try to. He chose a corner seat, away from the noise. When Emily approached, notepad in hand, he looked up, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. His eyes were calm, not restless like most people passing through town, not distracted, just present. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice professional, but softer than usual. "Coffee," he said simply. "Black." She nodded and returned moments later, placing the mug in front of him. "Passing through?" she asked, more out of habit than curiosity. "No," he replied. "I stay up in the mountains." That caught her attention. "Alone?" she asked before she could stop herself. A faint smile touched his lips. Most of the time, there was no awkwardness, no pressure, just a quiet exchange that lingered longer than expected. Over the next few days, he kept coming back, always the same order, always the same seat, and slowly conversations grew. His name was Luke Dawson. He didn't say much about himself, but he listened, really listened when Emily spoke. Whether she talked about her long shifts, the town gossip, or her childhood dreams of seeing something beyond the mountains, Luke paid attention like every word mattered. It was new to her. Most people talked, few truly heard. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in soft gold, Luke waited outside the diner as Emily finished her shift. "You always walk home alone?" he asked. She shrugged. "It's a small town. I'd walk with you," he said. It wasn't a question, and strangely, she didn't mind. They walked in comfortable silence at first, boots crunching against gravel, the cool air wrapping around them. The town lights flickered in the distance, but up here, everything felt quieter, simpler. "Why do you stay?" Luke asked after a while. Emily looked ahead. "Because I don't have a reason to leave." He nodded, as if he understood more than she said. Days turned into weeks. Luke never tried to impress her. No grand gestures, no fancy words, but he showed up consistently, and in a world full of uncertainty, that meant something. Then one morning, everything changed. The diner was quieter than usual. Emily was wiping down the counter when Luke walked in, but this time, he didn't sit. He stood in front of her. Serious. "Steady, Emily," he said. Something in his voice made her pause. "I'm not good with long speeches," he continued, "and I don't have much to offer. No big house, no wealth, just a cabin, and a life that's simple." Her heart began to race, though she didn't yet understand why. "But I can promise you this," he said. "Honesty, respect, and a partner who will stand beside you every day." Emily's breath caught. "I want you to marry me." The words hung in the air, quiet but powerful. No ring, no crowd, no drama, just truth. Her mind spun. This was sudden, unexpected, maybe even unreasonable, and yet she searched his face. There was no doubt there, no hesitation, just sincerity. "What if I say no?" she asked softly. Luke nodded once. "Then I will still wish you a good life." That answer settled something deep inside her. For the first time in a long time, Emily didn't feel pressure. She felt choice, and strangely, peace. She thought about her life, the struggles, the loneliness, the endless cycle of surviving rather than living. Then she thought about Luke, The quiet strength, the way he listened, the way he showed up without fail. Maybe he didn't have much, but what he offered felt real. Emily took a slow breath. Then, with a small but certain smile, she said, yes. The morning after the wedding felt almost unreal. There had been no grand ceremony, no flowing white dress or crowded reception, just a quiet exchange of vows at the town clerk's office. A simple promise spoken between two people who barely understood how much their lives were about to change. And yet, as Emily Carter sat beside Luke Dawson in his old pickup truck, watching the town slowly fade behind them, it felt right, not perfect, but right. The road grew narrower as they climbed higher into the mountains. Pine trees stretched endlessly on both sides, their shadows dancing across the windshield as sunlight filtered through. Emily held her small bag tightly in her lap, everything she owned, packed into one suitcase. You okay? Luke asked, his voice calm as ever. She glanced at him and nodded. Yeah, just thinking. He didn't press further. That was one thing she had already come to understand about him. Luke never forced words out of silence. After nearly an hour, the truck turned onto a dirt path barely visible between the trees. The tires crunched over gravel and dry leaves until, finally, the cabin came into view. It was smaller than she imagined. A single-story wooden cabin, withered but sturdy, with a slanted roof and a narrow porch out front. A few tools leaned against the wall, and a water trough sat nearby. Beyond it, open land stretched into the distance, with a small fenced area where two horses grazed peacefully. Emily stepped out of the truck slowly, taking it all in. This was home now. It's not much, Luke said, walking up beside her. But it's quiet. She looked at him, then back at the cabin. It's enough, she replied softly. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A small kitchen with wooden counters, a sturdy table with two chairs, a worn but comfortable couch near the fireplace, and a single bedroom tucked in the back. There were no decorations, no unnecessary things, just what was needed. That first day passed quietly. Emily unpacked her few belongings while Luke stepped outside to tend to the horses and check the fences. By the time the sun began to set, the cabin was filled with the warm glow of firelight and the soft crackling of wood burning in the hearth. I'll make dinner, Luke said. Emily raised an eyebrow. You cook? A faint smile appeared. Enough to survive. She laughed for the first time since arriving. Dinner was simple beans, bread, and something Luke called mountain stew. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, and somehow it tasted better than most meals she remembered. Maybe it was the quiet, or maybe it was the company. Days slowly began to form a rhythm. Morning started early. Luke was always up before sunrise, already outside by the time Emily woke. She would step onto the porch, wrapping a light jacket around herself, watching the golden light spill over the mountains as the world came alive. Sometimes she joined him, feeding the horses, carrying water, learning small things she had never done before. 81st, it felt unfamiliar. Her hands weren't used to this kind of work. But Luke never rushed her. He showed her patiently, guiding without making her feel incapable. You'll get it, he'd say, and slowly. She did. Evenings were her favorite. They'd sit together after dinner, sometimes talking, sometimes not. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was peaceful. A kind of quiet she had never known in her busy diner life. But as the days passed, Emily began to notice things, small things. Luke would disappear sometimes, not for long, an hour, maybe two, but without explanation. He'd saddle up one of the horses and ride deeper into the mountains, always returning before nightfall. Where do you go? She asked once. Just checking things, he replied. What things? He hesitated for a brief second. Land, that was all he said. Another time, she noticed something unusual while cleaning. A watch. It wasn't like anything she expected Luke to own. Sleek, polished, expensive looking. It sat tucked away in a drawer, almost hidden beneath old papers. She picked it up carefully, turning it in her hand. This didn't match the life he lived. When Luke came back inside, she held it up. This yours? His expression changed just slightly. Yeah, he said, taking it from her. Had it a long time. It looks valuable. He placed it back in the drawer and closed it. It's nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. Emily didn't push. Still, the question stayed in her mind. Who was Luke Dawson, really? The man she married was kind, steady, and honest in every way that mattered, but there were pieces of him she didn't understand, and somehow she felt those pieces were bigger than he was letting on. That night, as they lay in the quiet cabin, the wind brushing softly against the walls. Emily stared at the ceiling, her thoughts restless. She trusted him. She truly did, but trust didn't erase curiosity. Beside her, Luke shifted slightly. "You're thinking too much," he said quietly. She turned her head toward him. "Is it that obvious? Only when you go quiet like this." By the second week, the mountains no longer felt unfamiliar to Emily. They felt alive. Each morning brought a new rhythm, the whisper of wind through the trees, the distant call of birds, the soft crunch of boots against earth. The quiet that once seemed overwhelming had become something she looked forward to. And yet, beneath that calm, something else had begun to grow. A quiet curiosity. It started with small things, details that didn't quite fit into the simple life Luke Dawson lived. One afternoon, while Luke was out riding, Emily decided to do a deeper clean of the cabin. It wasn't large, but there were corners she hadn't paid much attention to before: drawers, shelves, and a small wooden chest stacked beneath the bed. She hesitated before opening it. "I'm not snooping," she muttered to herself, "just organizing." Still, her hands moved carefully, almost as if she expected something inside to explain everything she didn't yet understand. Inside the chest were old papers, neatly stacked and tied together. At first glance, they looked ordinary documents, maybe letters, but as she flipped through them, her brow slowly furrowed. These weren't just papers. They were property records, large ones, acres of land, far more than just the small area surrounding the cabin. Some documents had official seals, others had signatures that looked important. Though she couldn't recognize the names, Emily sat back on her heels, her heart beating just a little faster. "Land," she whispered, recalling Luke's vague answer. This wasn't just land. This was something big. She carefully placed everything back exactly as she found it and closed the chest, her thoughts spinning. When Luke returned that evening, nothing in his expression gave anything away. He greeted her the same way he always did, calm, steady, present. "You had a good day?" he asked. She studied him for a moment before answering. "Yeah, just cleaning." He nodded, setting his hat aside. "Looks nice." That was it. No questions, no concern. Either he trusted her completely, or he believed she hadn't found anything. That night, Emily couldn't sleep easily. The pieces didn't match. A man who lived in a small cabin, wore worn-out clothes, and cooked simple meals didn't usually own vast amounts of land unless he wasn't who he seemed. The next day brought another moment that deepened her unease. Emily had gone into town to pick up a few supplies. It felt strange being back after days in the mountains. The noise, the chatter, the familiar faces. As she stepped into the general store, the owner, Mrs. Harper, greeted her warmly. "Well, look at you," she said with a smile. "Settling into mountain life already?" Emily laughed lightly. "Trying to, Mrs. Harper leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "And Luke, treating you well?" "Yeah," Emily replied. "He's good." There was a pause. Then Mrs. Harper said, "Something unexpected, that man's got more to him than people think." Emily's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" The older woman shrugged casually, but her eyes held something knowing. "Just saying, folks around here respect him. Always have." "For what?" Emily pressed, but Mrs. Harper simply smiled and turned away. "You'll see." That answer lingered with her long after she left the store. Respect. Not sympathy. Not pity. Respect. That evening, when Emily returned to the cabin, Luke was already there, repairing a section of the fence. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land. She watched him for a moment before walking over. "People in town talk about you," she said. He didn't look up. "Small towns do that. They respect you." That made him pause just briefly before continuing his work. "They respect anyone who keeps to themselves and does their part," he replied. It sounded reasonable, but it didn't feel complete. "Luke," she said, her voice softer now, "why won't you just tell me everything?" He set the tool down slowly and finally looked at her. There was no anger in his eyes, only something deeper. "Because some things don't matter as much as you think," he said. "They matter to me." Silence stretched between them for a moment. Emily thought he might finally explain everything, but instead, he stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Do you trust me?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes," she said honestly. "Then let that be enough. Just a little longer." A little longer. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the one he gave. That night, Emily stood alone on the porch, staring Out of the endless stretch of mountains, the sky was filled with stars, brighter than she had ever seen them. Somewhere out there, Luke kept secrets, not dark ones, not dangerous ones, but important ones. She could feel it, and as much as she wanted to respect his silence. Her curiosity was no longer quiet. It was growing, and deep down, Emily knew whatever Luke was hiding, it was far bigger than a watch or land, or a few unanswered questions. It was a whole other life, one she hadn't yet been invited into. The air felt different that morning. Emily couldn't explain it, but something in the stillness of the mountains carried a quiet tension, like the world was holding its breath. She stepped out onto the porch, wrapping her arms around herself as the cool breeze brushed against her skin. The sky was painted in soft shades of gold and blue, the sun just beginning to rise over the peaks. Luke was already awake. He stood near the horses, saddling them with careful precision. That alone was unusual. He normally only prepared one. Two horses? Emily called out, walking toward him. Luke glanced at her, then nodded. We're going for a ride. She raised an eyebrow. We? A faint smile touched his lips. If you trust me. That word again, trust. Emily studied him for a moment. There was something different in his eyes today, not distant, not guarded, but resolved, like he had made a decision. Okay, she said finally. I trust you. The ride began quietly. They moved deeper into the mountains than Emily had ever gone before. The familiar paths disappeared, replaced by narrow trails winding through dense trees and rocky slopes. The air grew cooler, sharper, and the sounds of the world softened until all she could hear was the steady rhythm of hooves against the ground. First, Emily tried to take in the beauty, the towering pines, the distant ridges, the endless sky, but her curiosity quickly took over. Where are we going? She asked. You will see, Luke replied. Not for the first time. She wished he would give her a straight answer, but today felt different. Today, she didn't push. They rode for what felt like hours. Just as Emily began to think there was nothing out here but wilderness, the trees started to thin, and then they stopped. Come on, Luke said, dismounting. Emily followed, her boots hitting the ground softly as she stepped forward beside him. Close your eyes, he said. She blinked. What? Just for a second. She hesitated, then sighed lightly. If this is some kind of joke, it's not. Something in his tone made her pause. Slowly, she closed her eyes. Her heart began to beat faster as she felt him gently take her hand, guiding her forward. Each step felt deliberate, the ground shifting slightly beneath her feet as they moved. Okay, he said after a moment. Open them. Emily opened her eyes, and everything changed. The world in front of her was nothing like she expected. Gone were the tight clusters of trees and narrow paths. Instead, a vast hidden valley stretched out before her, wide, open, and breathtakingly beautiful. Rolling green land spread across the distance, surrounded by towering mountains that seemed to guard it like a secret, and at the center of it all a mansion. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It stood tall and elegant, its structure grand, yet somehow perfectly placed within the natural beauty around it. Large windows reflected the sunlight, and a long winding path led up to its entrance. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't speak. Luke, she whispered, what is this? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched her reaction, quiet, steady, almost as if this moment mattered more than anything he had ever said before. This, he said finally, is something I should have shown you sooner. Emily took a slow step forward, her eyes still fixed on the mansion. This doesn't make sense, she said, shaking her head slightly. We've been living in a cabin. And this is, she couldn't even find the word, mine. Luke said simply. The single word echoed louder than anything else. Emily turned to him sharply. Yours? He nodded. Her mind raced, trying to piece everything together. The watch, the land papers, the way people in town spoke about him. You're not poor, she said, her voice almost disbelieving. A faint, almost sad smile crossed his face. No, I'm not. Silence fell between them again. But this time, it was heavy, confusing, overwhelming. Then why? Emily asked it, her voice rising slightly. Why live like that? Why not tell me? Luke stepped closer, his expression calm but serious. Because none of this, he gestured toward the mansion, is who I am. Emily looked back at the massive home, then at him. How can you say that? She asked. This is your life. He shook his head slowly. It was. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through the valley as if carrying the weight of his words. I grew up in that house, Luke continued. Money, expectations, pressure, everything that comes with it. But somewhere along the way, I realized none of it made me feel real. Emily listened, her confusion slowly shifting into something else, understanding. Maybe. So you left? She asked. I walked away, he said. Chose something simpler, something honest. And me? She asked quietly. Luke met her eyes. You're the only part of my life I didn't walk away from, he said. You're the part I chose, her. Heart tightened at his words, but the questions didn't disappear. If you have all this, why bring me here now? Luke took a breath, his gaze steady. Because you deserve to know the truth. The valley felt too quiet. Emily stood there, her eyes shifting between Luke and the mansion, as if looking back and forth might somehow make it all make sense. But it didn't. The more she tried to understand, the more distant everything felt. You should see it, Luke said gently. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to turn back, to return to the cabin, to the simple life that now felt like a safe, familiar dream. But another part of her, the part that had always wondered what lay beyond her small-town life, urged her forward. Okay, she said quietly. They walked side by side down the long path leading to the mansion. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though she was crossing an invisible line between two completely different worlds. Up close, the mansion was even more breathtaking. Tall stone walls, large glass windows reflecting the sky, and a wide wooden door that looked like it belonged in another lifetime. It wasn't just wealth, it was history, legacy. Luke pushed the door open. Inside, the space was vast and filled with soft light. Polished floors stretched beneath their feet. Elegant furniture sat untouched, and a grand staircase curved upward toward the second floor. Emily stepped inside slowly. Her boots echoed. This, she whispered, turning in place. This is yours? Luke nodded. It's been in my family for years. She ran her fingers lightly across a smooth wooden table, almost afraid to touch anything. You left all this? She asked. Yes, just like that. It wasn't sudden, he said. It took time. Years, actually. Emily looked at him, searching his face for something, anything that would make this easier to accept. Why didn't you tell me before we got married? She asked. This time, there was no avoiding the question. Luke took a slow breath. Because I needed to know something first. What, if you saw me? All my life. Emily frowned. What does that mean? It means, he said, his voice calm but firm. I wanted someone to choose me for who I am, not what I have. The words landed heavily. Emily's chest tightened. So you tested me? She asked, a hint of hurt slipping into her voice. No, Luke said quickly. Not like that. I just didn't lead with this. He gestured around them. Because this isn't what matters to me, but it matters, Emily replied. You can't pretend it doesn't. I'm not pretending, he said. I walked away from this life because it never felt real. The expectations, the people, the constant pressure, it wasn't me. Emily crossed her arms slightly, trying to steady herself. And the cabin is? She asked. Yes, Luke said without hesitation. That's where I found peace. That's where I became myself. She looked down, processing everything. And you think I wouldn't have understood that? She asked quietly. Luke stepped closer. I didn't. No, if you would, he admitted. I've seen how people change when they see this kind of life. I didn't want that between us. Emily's eyes softened, but the conflict inside her didn't disappear. I'm not those people, she said. I know, he replied gently. Now I do. Silence settled between them again. But this time, it wasn't just confusion, it was emotion. Real, complicated emotion. Emily walked slowly toward one of the large windows, looking out at the valley below. The view was incredible, stretching farther than she could see. It was the kind of place people dreamed about. And yet, her mind drifted back to the cabin, the small kitchen, the quiet mornings, the way Luke smiled when he thought she wasn't looking. That life, she said softly, still facing the window. Was any of it real? Every second, Luke answered. She turned to him. I didn't lie to you, Emily, he continued. I just didn't tell you everything. There's a difference. She held his gaze. And now you know, he said. Everything that matters. Emily took a deep breath. It was a lot to take in. Too much, maybe. You should also know, Luke added, I never planned to come back here. Her brows knit slightly. Then why now? Because of you. That answer surprised her. You deserve honesty, he said. A real choice. Not a life built on half-truths. Emily looked around the room again. The mansion felt beautiful, but distant. like a place she could live in but not necessarily belong to. I don't know what to feel right now, she admitted. You don't have to decide anything today, Luke said.
Take your time, she nodded slowly. And if I choose the cabin? She asked. A small, genuine smile appeared on his face.
Then we go back, he said.
And nothing changes. And if I choose this? She pressed.
Luke paused for just a moment. Then we figure out what that means.
Together. That answer felt different. Less certain, but honest. Emily
walked past him, heading back toward the door.
The sunlight outside felt warmer now, grounding her in something familiar.
As she stepped out, she took one last look at the mansion.
It wasn't just a house. It was a truth she hadn't expected, a life she hadn't asked for, and a choice she never thought she'd have to make.
Luke followed her outside, giving her space, not rushing her thoughts. For the first time since she said yes in that quiet diner.
Emily wasn't sure what came next.
But one thing was clear, this wasn't just a love story anymore. It was a test of trust, truth,
and what truly mattered. The ride back to the cabin felt longer than the journey there. Neither of them spoke much. The sound of hooves against the ground filled the silence, steady and rhythmic, but it did little to quiet Emily's thoughts. Her mind replayed everything: Luke's words, the mansion, the truth he had kept hidden. It wasn't just about the wealth, it was about trust.
When they finally reached the cabin, the sun had already begun to set, casting a soft amber glow across the mountains.
Everything looked the same: the porch, the fence, the quiet simplicity of their life.
But it didn't feel the same.
Not anymore. Emily climbed down from the horse and walked inside without a word. Luke followed a few moments later, setting things down quietly, giving her space. She stood in the middle of the room, looking around. The small table,
the worn couch,
the fireplace. Just yesterday, this place had felt like the beginning of something steady, something real. Now, it felt like a question. Say something, Luke said gently. Emily let out a slow breath, turning to face him. I don't know where to start. Start anywhere. She crossed her arms slightly, not out of anger, but to hold herself together. You should have told me, she said. I know, before we got married. I know, he repeated. She studied his face, searching for defensiveness.
For excuses, but there were none.
Just quiet acceptance.
Why didn't you trust me with the truth?
She asked.
Luke stepped closer, his voice calm but honest.
It wasn't about not trusting you, he said. It was about being afraid.
Of losing something real before it even had a chance to exist. Emily shook her head slightly.
That doesn't make it better. I didn't think it would, he admitted. Silence settled again. This time, it wasn't heavy, it was fragile. I need you to understand something, Emily said, her voice softer now. I didn't marry you for money. You know that, right? I do, Luke said immediately.
Then why take the choice away from me?
She asked.
Why not let me decide with all the truth in front of me? That question lingered longer than the others. Because this time, Luke didn't
have an easy answer. I was wrong, he said finally. It was simple, direct, and real. Emily blinked slightly, caught off guard. You're just going to say that? She asked. What else should I say? He replied.
I can't change how I handled it.
I can only be honest now. There was no pride in his voice. No attempt to defend himself, just truth.
And somehow, that made it harder to stay upset.
Emily turned away, walking slowly toward the window.
Outside, the sky had deepened into shades of purple and blue, the first stars beginning to appear.
I don't belong in that world, she said quietly.
That mansion,
that life, it's not me. You don't have to be, Luke said from behind her.
She turned back.
But it's you. He shook his head. It's a part of my past, not who I chose to become. But it's still yours, she insisted. You can't just erase it. I'm not trying to erase it, he said.
I just don't want it to define me. Emily looked at him for a long moment.
And what if it changes things? She asked. It will, Luke said honestly.
That answer surprised her.
You're not even going to pretend it won't, she asked.
No, he said.
Because it already has. He stepped closer, his voice steady. But that doesn't mean it has to change us. Emily felt her chest tighten slightly.
Luke, I don't even know what us is anymore.
That was the truth, and saying it out loud made it real.
For the first time since they met, uncertainty stood between them. Luke didn't react immediately.
He didn't rush to fix it. Instead, he nodded slowly, accepting her words.
Then we
figure it out, he said. One step at a time. Emily let out a quiet breath. You make everything sound so simple. It's not simple, he replied. But it doesn't have to be complicated either. She almost smiled at that. Almost. What do you want? Luke asked after a moment. The question caught her off guard. What do you mean?
I mean, he said, if none of this, he gestured vaguely, as if including both the cabin
and the mansion was part of the decision. What would you choose? Emily looked down, thinking carefully. It wasn't about the house. Not really. It wasn't even about the money. It was about how she felt. Safe, seen,
respected. She thought about the mornings on the porch, the quiet dinners,
the way Luke listened without trying to change her.
Then she looked at him.
I choose honesty, she said.
Luke nodded. That's fair, and I choose time, she added. The next few days passed quietly, but not in the same way as before.
This silence wasn't uncertain. It was thoughtful.
Emily moved through the cabin with a different kind of awareness now, noticing every detail more deeply, the creak of the
wooden floor, the warmth of the morning sunlight, the way the mountains seemed to breathe around her. Everything felt real, but so did the choice in front of her.
Luke didn't pressure her. True to his word, he gave her space. He still woke early, still worked outside, still lived as if nothing had changed. And maybe that's what helped
her the most.
He hadn't suddenly become someone else.
He was still the same man.
One afternoon, Emily sat alone on the porch, a warm cup in her hands, watching the horses graze in the distance.
The air was calm, carrying the soft scent of pine and earth.
Her thoughts drifted back to the mansion,
the polished floors, the endless space, the life it represented.
For a moment, she tried to picture herself there, dressed differently, living differently, surrounded by things she had never known. It looked beautiful in her imagination, but it didn't feel like home.
Not the way this did. She heard footsteps
behind her.
You've been quiet, Luke said, stepping onto the porch.
Emily smiled faintly. I've been thinking.
He leaned against the railing, giving her space but staying close.
About, he asked.
She looked out toward the mountains.
Everything. He nodded.
That makes sense. There was a pause.
Then Emily turned to him.
Take me back there, she said. Luke's brows lifted slightly. The mansion?
She nodded.
Are you sure?
He asked.
Yes, this time. The ride felt different.
Not tense.
Not uncertain. Just purposeful. When they reached the valley again, Emily didn't
react with shock like before.
Instead, she took it in slowly, as if seeing it clearly for the first time.
They walked inside together.
The mansion was just as grand, just as impressive.
But now, Emily noticed something she hadn't before.
It felt empty. Not physically, but
emotionally.
This place is beautiful, she said, her voice echoing slightly. It is, Luke replied. But it doesn't feel like you, she added. That made him pause. It never did, he admitted.
Emily walked through the large room, her fingers brushing lightly against the furniture, the walls, the smooth surfaces.
That reflected a life of wealth.
Then she turned to him. I think I understand now. Luke stepped closer.
Understand what? Why you left, she said. There was no judgment in her voice, only clarity. You had everything, except
what mattered, she continued.
Luke watched her carefully, as if afraid to interrupt the moment.
And out there, she gestured faintly toward the mountains beyond the windows. You found something real. He nodded slowly.
I did. Emily smiled softly.
So did I. Those words settled between them, quiet but powerful. Luke
exhaled slightly, as if he had been holding something in for a long time. Then what do you want? He asked. Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked past him, toward the large front doors. She opened them, letting the fresh mountain air rush inside.
Then she turned back to him. I don't want this life, she said honestly. Luke didn't react with surprise.
He simply listened.
I don't want a mansion, she continued, or a life that feels distant. She stepped closer to
him now, her voice steady.
I want the mornings in the cabin, the quiet dinners,
the simple things that actually feel like living. Luke's expression softened. And you? He asked quietly.
Do you still want me?
Emily smiled this time, without hesitation. I never stopped. The tension that had quietly lingered between them finally began to fade. But, she added gently, that doesn't mean this place has no purpose. Luke frowned slightly. What do you mean? Emily looked around again, not with distance this time, but with intention. This doesn't have to be about wealth, she said. It could be about something
more. He waited.
We could use this place, she continued. Not for status, but for something meaningful. Like what? He asked. Emily thought for a moment.
A place for people, she said.
For families who need space. For gatherings, for
something that brings life into it. Luke considered her words carefully. No one had ever suggested that before. This place has been empty for years, he said slowly. Then maybe it's time it wasn't, Emily replied. There was something in her voice, something hopeful, something certain.
And for the first time, the mansion didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an opportunity.
Luke looked at her, really looked at her.
You're not choosing between the two, are you? He said. Emily shook her head. No, she replied. I'm choosing us. A small smile spread across
his face. That sounds like the right choice. She laughed softly.
I think so too.
They stood there together, the open doors letting light and air flow through the once silent space.
For the first time, the mansion didn't feel empty.
It felt like a beginning.
Not of a different life, but of a shared one.
A life where love came first.
And everything else
found its place around it. The mountains had never felt more alive. Weeks had passed since Emily made her choice, not between the cabin and the mansion, but between fear and certainty. And now, standing on the porch of the once empty estate, she
watched as sunlight poured across the valley, warming everything it touched. But this time, the mansion wasn't empty. It was changing. Careful with that box, Emily called out, smiling as two local workers carried supplies through the front doors. Laughter echoed inside something that had likely never happened here before. Luke stepped up beside her, wiping his hands with a cloth.
You've turned this place upside down, he said lightly. Emily glanced at him, amused. You say that like it's a bad thing. He shook his head, a quiet smile forming.
It's the best thing that's ever happened to it, and he meant it. What was once a silent symbol of wealth had slowly become something else entirely. Alive. After that day in the valley, Emily and Luke had made a decision together. They didn't abandon the cabin. It was still their home, their anchor, but they refused to let the mansion remain a forgotten relic of the past. Instead, they gave it purpose. It started small, a few repairs, cleaning out unused rooms, opening
the doors to people in the nearby town who needed space, families, travelers, even small gatherings. At first, people were hesitant. The mansion had always been seen as distant, almost untouchable, but Emily changed that. She welcomed everyone with
the same warmth she once showed at the diner.
No judgment, no expectations,
just kindness, and slowly, people came. I still can't believe you did all this, Luke said, looking round as more voices filled the space behind them. Emily leaned against the porch railing. Neither can I, he glanced at her.
You could have chosen a completely different life, you know, she smiled softly.
I did choose a different life. Luke raised an eyebrow slightly, just not the one you expected. She added, that made him laugh quietly. Inside, the mansion now held signs of real living tables, set for shared meals, rooms prepared for guests, windows open to let in fresh air and sunlight. It no longer felt like a place meant to impress. It felt like a place meant to belong. Later that evening, as the last of the guests settled in and the noise faded into a gentle hum, Emily and Luke returned to the cabin. Home, the fire crackled softly. As Emily sat down, slipping off her shoes with a tired but content sigh, still prefer this? Luke asked, leaning against the doorway. She looked around the small room. The familiar warmth, the quiet comfort, always, she said. He nodded. Stepping inside, there was something grounding about this place. No matter what changed, the cabin remained the same, a reminder of where everything truly began. Luke sat beside her, the silence between them no longer uncertain, but deeply understood. You know, he said after a moment, I spent years trying to escape that life. Emily glanced at him. And now I realize, it wasn't the life I needed to escape, he said. It was how I saw it. She tilted her head slightly. Meaning, it only felt empty because I was alone in it, he admitted. Now, it's different. Emily smiled. Because we changed it, she said. No, Luke replied gently. Because you did, she shook her head. We did, and that was the truth. This wasn't his world anymore, and it wasn't just hers either. It was theirs. Built not on wealth or appearances or expectations, but on something far more lasting. Trust, honesty, and love. Emily rested her head lightly against his shoulder, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them. Do you ever regret it? She asked quietly. Regret what? Not telling me from the beginning. Luke thought for a moment. Yes, he said honestly. But if I had done things differently, we might not be here. Emily considered that. Life had a strange way of unfolding, not perfectly, not predictably, but often exactly as it needed to. I'm glad we're here, she said softly. Me too. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the quiet sounds of the mountains into the night. Inside, Everything felt still, peaceful, complete. Emily closed her eyes, a small smile resting on her lips. She had started this journey, thinking she was marrying a poor mountain cowboy, but what she found was something far greater. Not a mansion, not wealth, but a man who chose truth over comfort, and love over everything else, and in the end, she realized something simple, yet
powerful. She hadn't just found a new life. She had found a place where she truly belonged, with him always.